Okay, hello. We just hit beta of Classy UI, and the reason we are hitting beta is because now we have figured out what Classy UI really is. Because it was initially inspired by Tailwind CSS, and it very much is inspired still. But we are not reproducing the class names of Tailwind CSS now. We're doing it a little bit differently, and I'll explain why. But I thought we could just go through the documentation, and I can talk about the changes. So Classy UI is an atomic design system inspired by the wonderful Tailwind CSS, where Tailwind CSS is a class names abstraction over CSS properties that gives you a consistent set of utilities to design your application. This abstraction does not only make your design consistent, but in combination with Classy UI, it also allows other benefits not possible when defining your design with CSS properties. So with Classy UI, you don't start with any CSS at all. It produces the CSS based on the class names you actually produce in your code. Classy UI is also able to completely get rid of specificity issues. You don't even think about it. And when you write the class names, you can actually search them in your code because they are automatically typed. And even if you're not using TypeScript, you will have the class names in your code and you can search them. And if you use an invalid class name, Classy UI will actually give an error in the application. So the naming of the class names in Classy UI is based on the CSS properties themselves. Like Tailwind CSS has taken a lot of freedom in defining their class names in a way that makes sense, but they are not always a one-to-one to the, well, rarely a one-to-one to the actual CSS properties. So you kind of like have to learn CSS and their properties, and then you have to learn the class names on top of that with Tailwind. So one reason that we are creating class names that actually reflects CSS properties is that you can just start using it and you know the CSS properties, so it's natural to find the correct class names. Second, by defining the class names by CSS property, we also handle specificity issues. Yes, so all the class names are produced by variables in the configuration, and you have a default set of variables. And the awesome thing about Classy UI is that when you add a theme, which basically means a theme is overriding variables. And if you do that, it will actually make the variables CSS variables in the output. You don't think about this stuff, but it's like highly optimized. And then it includes normalized CSS by default. You don't have to think about that. Okay, so I'm talking about these variables. So this is the configurable part of Classy UI. And by default, you have the variables of breakpoint, spacing, colors, font family, border widths, letter spacing, border radius, line height, box shadows, and opacity. We might expose more variables here. But yeah, those are the variables, and you can override these. If you want to do that. So for example, you have a bunch of different colors available in Classy UI, but if you're on a project with a designer, you want to limit to the actual colors of the project, and then you can do that. So as you can see here, each variable is defined by a variant, which is the key, and then the value, which will be used. So for example, opacity, with this set of variables, will produce the following class names: opacity 0, opacity 25, opacity 50, opacity 75, and opacity 100. And again, a designer could define these instead. And the cool thing about variants is that there are like design tokens. So for a designer, they might give a name to a certain opacity, and that opacity then has a value. So this is a really nice way to bring the design tokens into your code through these variables. Because if you were to rather define it like this, none, faded, and full, then you will produce the class names opacity none, opacity faded, and opacity full. And this is automatically typed. Yes, but to consume the actual class names, you use this C function, which you import from Classy UI. And this is where you compose the different class names together. And the strength of Classy UI is that it's JavaScript. So you can compose class names together, create variables, take one variable, compose it into a new definition. You can do dynamic stuff, as I'll show you. So if you are afraid that the class name is long, that doesn't matter. They're just very explicit. First of all, you never write the full class name because you get autocompletion in your code editor. And also you won't typically inline the class names with your UI definition. You will rather define the sets of application-specific class names as variables, and then you would rather consume those. Yes. So anyways, what Classy UI does is allow you to compose these class names, and then it will produce an actual class name string, where it handles things like pseudo selectors, as you see with the hover here, and specificity issues and all that stuff. Okay. If you have seen this before, I'll probably repeat myself a little bit, but let's move on here. Okay, so how would you use it? First of all, you can inline it, of course, here showing it with React, but you would typically lift it out and compose it together. So you would actually name the compositions of the class names because they are quite low level. They probably, like a single class name doesn't really give any meaning, typically. So you rather want to lift it up and compose it together. And then you can take it a step further. You can move these variables into their own file, for example, where they become reusable across different components. And as we can see here we see composition in action. So we have a base button, but then we have an alert button that composes in the button. And then you can, since we're in JavaScript, we can take it even further. We can create factories. So instead of defining a static composition, we can create a dynamic one by using a function. So you can pass arguments into this function, and then you can start dynamically adding class names. And the way you do that is that you use an object. So the object takes the key, which is a class name, and then you can say true or false if it should be active or not. And then you can take it even a step further. So now we're talking about like style components, because typically when you, for example, here we pass in disabled, it's not only the CSS you want to manage. You want to use that state to manage the elements themselves. So here we rather create a button component, which takes a disabled state and the children. And then we rather compose the class name inside the component. And again, we use the disabled state. And then we return the actual button with the class name. And we also add the disabled state to the button itself. So this is how I imagine how I would use it. I would create a bunch of UI components that takes in some property. And then I will use that to compose the class names and whatever is needed for the element itself. Yes. So the question is then, how does it actually work? How is it able to do this? So when you're in development and you create a composition of class names, it will actually convert it to something like this. Oh, this is a typo. We're using normalize now instead of preflight. I'm going to change that. Anyways, it imports normalize, and it actually does this in every single file, but it doesn't matter because your build system will deduplicate those imports automatically. And then it imports a function called add classes, which comes from the runtime. And then the plugin will then inject what class names should be added with what CSS. And the plugin already knows what classes has already been added. So if color gray 800 and background color gray 200 had already been added, it would just remove all the code. It wouldn't even be there. Except this, of course. This would still be there. Oh, I see I have a typo here as well. Shouldn't be a comma there. Sorry. I'll fix that. Oh yeah, Yeah, so I forgot to change this. I'm mentioning preflight again, but we're only using normalize now. Okay, anyways, but in production, the same example actually results in this. So now the plugin rather produces a style file, like a CSS file, and it is actually able to shorten all the class names. So all the classes become super tiny variations of themselves, which is really, really cool. So we can minimize the CSS really, really well. And again, we use the same trick where we import the style file in all the files, and then your build tool will deduplicate. So you will only get one CSS file. Yes. And then how do we handle specificity? Well, the cool thing is that we have this concept of base classes. So color, background color, border radius, display, all like the properties of CSS, those are base classes. And then you add variations on top of them. And since we know what are base classes, we know that you don't want to have two of the base classes. You only want, in any composition, you only want one base class. So in this example here, you can see that we have two base classes. We have background color gray 200 and background color red 500. So when Classy UI evaluates this, it initially evaluates it to this. So it takes the button and it adds the background color. But that's a problem because now we get two background colors. And because we don't know the order that these background colors has been added in the actual CSS, like that's impossible to control and would create scenarios that would just not work. We have to remove one of them. So the way we do this is not exact code, but like just to get the point out, what we do is that we go into the what was composed in, and we remove any background color. Because we said that, okay, we are composing in a background color here, so we want to remove any existing background colors. And then we add the original background color. So we handle specificity at the insertion of the class names, not in the CSS itself, because that's just impossible to do, first of all, automatically. And it's just a mental burden you don't want. Cool. And then we have how you set it up. So in the beta, we also include normalize, which means that you do not only install the plugin with Webpack, you also need to install the style loader and the CSS loader. And that is for Webpack to handle the normalize. And also when you output for production, you have a CSS file that you want Webpack to handle. But then you just start using it. With Parcel, this is included, so you can just add the plugin. Just beware that Parcel took the wrong choice in its first version related to TypeScript, which, like, not the wrong choice, but it's because of history and Babel being able to handle TypeScript very well came after Parcel was released, I guess. And anyway, so if you want to use TypeScript with with Parcel 1, you have to install an additional plugin for Parcel. But in Parcel 2, this will just work out of the box. Create React app, super simple. Just install it, start using it, only that you use the macro version. Next.js, also quite simple. You configure a Babel RC file where you bring in the next Babel and then Classy UI plugin, and then you can start using it. Yes. I don't know if I should go into all of this. Class names, I've talked about that. We have a bunch of pseudo decorators, which means that we have a bunch of functions that you can use to kind of decorate the class names, giving them only run on hover, on disabled, focus, active, visited, blah, blah, blah. The same for group decorators. You can give an element the group decorator, and then any child of that group element can then use the decorators of group hover, group focus, group active, and so on. And then the hover will activate when the parent group actually has the hover. Yes. And then we have screen decorators, which is basically based on the breakpoints of the variables. So by default, you have like small, medium, large, and extra large. And these are media queries. And for example, here we add the medium screen decorator, which means that this will only be read up to 768 pixels. And you can of course configure this, but it's not only the media query you can configure the decorator itself. So you can define them as, for example, mobile, tablet, and desktop. And then you get those imports instead, and they are typed. Yes, so if you're happy with the base config, you can just start using it. But if you want to make changes, you can create a classy UI config file, which has the following properties. You can override the variables, you can override the screens, you can add some themes, and you can even create new class names if you want to do that, or override existing class names. So variables, the way these work is that you are free to add whatever you want. And if you were to add an existing variable like colors, you will replace it. You can merge them, which I will show you, but you replace it. So these are basically the variables. They don't have any effect on themselves. But if you were to theme your application, have themes, and then you point to different variables that you want to theme, those become CSS variables in the output. Anyways, so this is how you do it. And if you want to compose in, or you want to merge in with the existing, you can use a function instead. And then you get the default properties, or sorry, default variables. And then you can rather return a set of variables based on that. Okay, and then we have the screens. The screens is a set of keys which will become the decorators, the screen decorators. As I said, you can use mobile, desktop, and tablet, and then you import those decorators with those names. And the way you define it is that you just get the CSS. It's a function where you get the CSS, and then you define the media query, and then you just insert the CSS where it makes sense. So you have full freedom in defining your media query. Blah, blah, blah. Yes. Yeah, so here we can see that we have the breakpoints. So this is basically how the initial screens are defined. So you have the breakpoints, and when you define the screens, you actually, the first argument is the CSS, the second argument are the variables. So you can use the variables to define the screens. So you could even have like a theme that overrides some breakpoint variables, which gives you different media queries, which is kind of cool. And I talked a lot about themes. They basically work like this. You give it a name, and then you start overriding variables. That's it. And those variables now become CSS variables. So the way you would use it is, this is an inline example where we use React. Oh, there's a typo here as well. 2 typos I need to fix. What we do here is that we are using the class name composer. We are using a dynamic class name of themes dark. So all the themes will have a specific name, and that will be themes dash the name of the theme. So we want to activate that theme when we have a state that says that we want the dark theme. And when that happens, it just works. Cool. Yes. And the class names it's really interesting how we define them, because you give it a base, which we have decided to be the CSS properties themselves. And then you add some variants. And these variants will produce in combination with the base, will produce the class names. So as we can see, background, yeah. So as we can see here, these variants will produce these class names. And then you have the CSS property, which is a function that takes the name of the CSS class or the class name. And then it takes the value, which comes from the variants, and then you write out the actual CSS that you want to be inserted. Yes. And then you can do all sorts of cool stuff. You can do, here's a typo as well. The variables shouldn't be here. Anyways, so maybe you want a class name called placeholder because you want to color the placeholders. But placeholder has this weird, I don't know what it's even called. It's not like a pseudo selector. It's like a pseudo selector, something. So you can even add that kind of stuff. So you have like a placeholder and you have a couple of variants. And that would produce placeholder gray, placeholder black, and then it would just work. You can even use a function for the variants. So in this case, we have a set of variables with the colors, and then we can create a class name of called color, where the variants are the variables. So this would result in two different class names, color-red and color-blue. So this is really cool how you can use the variables to produce the variants. It's really, really cool. Yes. Yes, and then you can even define it as a plain function. So for example, you want a class name named truncate. And then, typo as well. Sorry about this. You should have the name here. But here we just create a class name which takes a specific set of CSS, and now you have a way to create ellipses for your text. So you have a lot of flexibility in the configuration, and currently you don't have a way to start completely from scratch. You are extending the base configuration. Maybe we'll change that if someone wants to do it from scratch. But yeah, and this warning down here just states that these base classes is what defines specificity. So you wouldn't want to, for example, combine like have just a base class of padding, and then you would kind of like create a ton of variants for padding top, padding bottom, padding left, padding right. Because then if you had a composition where you had some padding top and then you composed that into something that added padding bottom, then padding bottom would override padding top because it's part of the same base name. But yeah, it's explained in this warning. Cool. I guess that's it. So I will fix the typos. We are in a position now where we just need to test this. If you have been testing previously, I'm sorry that we changed the class names, but it's typed, so you should get errors when you install the new version. And I think we did we had to do something about the Tailwind configuration because it didn't support our specificity strategy. And also initially when we talked about class UI, people were happy about having class names that reflects the properties. The properties they actually manipulate. So I think it will be easier to get going with class UI, and you don't have to spend so much brain power on thinking, okay, this is the CSS property I want, what is it called in the library? Like it's the same name. Sweet. I guess that's it. I hope you like it and can test it. And specifically, we want to test the production output. I think there are a couple of bugs there now. But yeah, we have to look into that. And I'm super excited to get this thing released because I think it's like this is a unique approach in the ecosystem of managing, not managing state, but managing styles and design systems. That's kind of maybe the thing I'm most excited about. It's the variables because you can, sorry, now I'm starting to ramble, but let's see, introduction. So you can sit down with a designer and then you can talk about how do you want to restrict this team in terms of design? Well, you should only have this kind of spacing. You should only have these kinds of colors. These are the breakpoints for the different screens. These are the fonts we're going to use. You should only have 2 different border widths, for example. These are the 2 border radiuses we operate with. And this is really, really important to get a consistent design. And I've been in so many projects where we do have a designer, but they aren't able to transfer the way they define and think and create tokens and stuff into the actual code and enforce those restrictions in the code. But I think this is a really great tool to do that. Yes, and with that, I'll finish my, I guess this became like an introduction to Classy UI. I haven't written any code, but anyways, I think the concept is more important to get through, and then you can rather play around with it. Cool, bye bye.